Yeah, you see a lot on there's no endless supply of bear tracks, double tracks, bear tracks that are submitted as Sasquatch tracks. And I see those all the time. You probably got quite a few of those sent your way.
Oh, yeah. In fact, it's interesting. Lately, I recently was asked to submit a chapter for a book about bears. And it turns out that this was a book that looked about the culture and the history and the biology and so forth, all aspects of bear. And it was an edited volume. They had multiple contributors, and they had one individual. She was a professional guide up in British Columbia who was going to submit a chapter on Bigfoot and bears. And apparently, because of personal reasons or something, she was unable to fulfill her commitment. And so I think they were scrambling a little bit, but they came to me, and they sent me the outline, the précis of the book and the outline with all the contributors list, and then her paragraph of what her writing was going to be, and her abstract basically. And of course, and hers was going to be that while drawing attention to these remarkable parallels between Bigfoot or Sasquatch and bears, ultimately the bottom line was Sasquatch simply embodies the human-like characters that bears display. It's just simply, misappropriation of bear qualities, of bears. And I wrote back and I said, "You did Google me before you asked me to do this." And I said, I'll be happy to do this, and I'll take the same tack that she took, but I'll end up in exactly the diametrically opposite position. And they go, "Oh, we realize that." Yeah, we realize. So I did, and it was a great opportunity to kind of lay this out and address some of the stuff that's out there. What's his name? Oh, shucks, this is terrible. I'm getting worse and worse with names.
Yeah, you're over 50. It's okay.
I know, yeah. He has written, he's a skeptical writer, and he wrote a book recently called Man Beasts, something about man beasts. But anyway, he had written a piece for the Skeptical Inquirer called Bigfoot Lookalikes. And so I drew upon his paper as well, too, for that. But you're right, footprints. I mean, so I had the opportunity in this article to actually do basically a footprints 101, and not only include all the distinctions between Sasquatch and human foots. Basically, I reproduced my figure from my field guide, and then explained it, discussed it in the text. But the other half of that conversation was the distinctions with bear tracks. And it's not rocket. In my presentations, I've done a presentation on Bigfoot and bears now that as a result of writing that chapter a number of times. And like I say, it's not rocket science. You can be not an expert maybe, but a knowledgeable observer of bear sign and be quite capable of distinguishing between bear and Sasquatch, potential Sasquatch sign, with just spending a half an hour, 15 minutes online. You can make your own little archive of bear pictures, and then read my field guide, and then you got it. But they can be distinguished quite readily, even if there is the situation of the fore and hind paw registering to eliminate the appearance of a quadrupedal trackway, so that it looks like just a biped walking there. There still are numerous characteristics to distinguish between the two. So, yeah.
It takes away the glory, though, Thought I had a Sasquatch track there for a minute, but no, it's a bear. It can't be a bear.
I know.
It can't be a Sasquatch.
Well, see, and that brings up another point. That takes away the glory, because, that's an important point to make. This is one of the distinctions when you interact with, and I encourage citizen science, I always use the term amateur very tentatively and carefully qualified way, because I realize that there are a lot of, quote, non-professionals who aren't getting paid. This isn't their day job, but who bring remarkable skills and experience to the table. But there are others who don't. And, if you don't educate yourself, if you don't cultivate those abilities and skills, then you remain an amateur. But the other part of this is those that have gone through the training, the scientific training, part of that training is getting comfortable. It's never completely comfortable, but because no one likes to be criticized, but shouldn't be directed at the individual. Although I fall prey to that sometimes too, and sometimes some people deserve to be criticized in public, but it's the basis of their work, really, that's the criticism, and you have to submit your ideas and your evidence to peer review. But there's a lot of enthusiasts, we'll use that term, out there, for whom their discovery, that's their piece of the activity, of the game, of the involvement. That's their badge of participation. And so when you criticize or are critical of that evidence, they take it as a personal affront. They take it as a personal affront, or they react to the threat, the perceived threat, to their claim to glory, as you call it.
Yeah.
And that's unfortunate. That leads to hurt feelings and then retribution and all sorts of nastiness that ensues sometimes. You should learn from the process and then go out there and forge ahead, better qualified, better with a better skill set.
Exactly.
And I sorry to step on you there, Tate, but I think that's it's good for people to hear that, because I've done a lot of follow-up investigations on things, and based on my observations and years of looking into it, come up with a solution that it's not what they thought it was, possibly. I get a lot of flack back from that, and it's just like it's like walking on eggshells, trying to be as diplomatic as possible and respectful.
Right. Yeah.
At the same time, trying to encourage them to continue what they're doing, but just ponder the evidence a bit more before they jump to conclusions. Right. Don't show up saying, I've got a Squatch sighting. Show up saying, I got to see what's here first before I come to conclusion.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
I always reflect back on, I was at a conference and someone stood up with their little digital recorder and they played a barred owl call. And it was no question. Everyone in the room that was familiar at all with wildlife vocalizations immediately recognized it. And, someone pointed out, well, I'm sorry, but that's a barred owl. And several people concurred. And he goes, oh, no. Sasquatch can imitate barred owls. Well, if they can imitate them that well, how are you going to know the difference? Because he had a sighting or experience to go with it. It was simply a recording. So people can sometimes convince themselves of things because they're motivated. They really want to have that experience. And I've dealt with so many people. I mean, one time when I was out in, I think it was in Ohio, and there's a park, a reserve, and there's a gated dirt road that cuts right through. And so it's a favorite place to hike for Bigfoot enthusiasts, because there have been reports from that area. And we had there was just a torrential rain. So the next day, there was all kinds of soft mud and mud puddles and so forth. And I'm not kidding. Every time we would come to, a mud puddle that had the faintest resemblance to an oval footprint, it was this. Could this be a? At least they were equivocal about it. Could this be a Sasquatch print? And we talked about it and say, well, there's no details to really make that conclusive or draw that conclusion. And I said, but we're right in the middle of all this mud. If this was an imprint of this size and dimension and depth, don't you think there might be one in front and behind it as well? Track. Oh, yeah. And I was thinking we'd get 10 yards down the road. Well, what about this one? What about this one? Another mud puddle. So, I don't want to dampen the enthusiasm. That's great to get to do it, but you've got to, you have to remember too that these things, in my opinion, and I think it's a justified opinion, or inference, if you will, because it's not just based on an opinion, it's based on lots of evidence, lots of clues. These are very rare and solitary creatures that range over very large areas, a very large home range, 1,000 square miles perhaps or more. And so to have an encounter, the credible encounters out there, the documented, corroborated encounters by footprints or hair, whatever, they happened usually purely by chance, by happenstance. The witnesses were not out to encounter a Sasquatch. And so if you are out to encounter a Sasquatch, it's like I say, it's just like a lottery ticket in many ways. One, you don't win the lottery unless you buy tickets, right?
Mm-hmm.
More time you spend out there, the better your chances are. But nevertheless, even with all those purchases, what are the odds? Pretty slim to nil. So, you may get a few numbers. You may find a hair strand, or you may have a suspicious vocalization, but to have that encounter. So when people go out, I warn them. I had this one conversation. This guy kept describing all these encounters he was having on every weekend. He'd go out every weekend and have these encounters. I said, well, that's really amazing. I told him how rare Sasquatch were. And I said, your ability to interact with this very rare animal is really amazing. You must have a knack. This must be something. Tell you what, you're so good at this. Why don't you, this next weekend you go out, bring me back a picture of a deer. Doesn't even have to be a buck, just a deer, a doe. I mean, there must be 1,000 deer for every Sasquatch out where you're looking. So you should be able to find some sign and find spotted deer and snap a picture of it for me. And he's looking at me, and you can see the wheels turning, and he's finally realizing what the point that I'm trying to make, which he didn't really appreciate, but I think, at least he took it to heart.
Yeah.
But that's just it. Every time I'm out there and people, well, do you think, and sometimes people will ask me, well, do you think there's a Sasquatch around? Well, there might be, but I said, do you think there's a fox? Do you think there's a coyote? Let's see if we can see a coyote. That we'll probably have a lot more chance of seeing a coyote than we would a Sasquatch. Chances, but
Exactly.
So you got to keep perspective. But like I said, not to discourage. The more eyes and ears that are out there, that's the thing. Why I'm so keen on, quote, citizen science, and why I try not to lose my patience interacting with individuals, and I'm always eager to try to inform and instruct and teach, is because this is not the kind of topic where I, as a single scientist, can go out and systematically collect data in the field. I can't just run a transect across a stretch of forest and look for Sasquatch sign. I mean, I can take that approach if I want, but my odds of intersecting with Sasquatch activity by doing that, as compared to so many other animals that are so much more numerous out there, is pretty slim to nil. And so there is a lot of reactionary activity as opposed to proactive activity. I mean, even our approach to DNA analysis. I've been, now that COVID is maybe, we'll see, COVID kind of took the wind out of all of our projects, sales, but I'm reviving this notion of getting out and collecting water and soil samples to examine using eDNA techniques. But see, even that's kind of a reactionary. We're looking for this passively accumulated sample that's out there, hopefully that's been concentrated by the repeated activities of Sasquatch in the area, and then using techniques that can concentrate those rare samples so that we might have a chance of doing it. I've even been talking to some folks that actually use techniques of mass collection of mosquitoes, and then they sample the blood in the mosquitoes to see what animals are being bitten, and maybe there's a Sasquatch sample to be had that way. So we're going to explore that avenue as well. So these will be new directions, new ventures, trying to go beyond the old methods, which still have their role, their place. Trail cameras and hair snags and audio recordings and so forth.
Gotta go for it.
Yeah. This is the last thing I have, and then Tate, I'll let you ask your last good questions.
Real quick, I'm just gonna grab my phone charger because my phone's almost dead.
Okay.
So yeah, keep going.
Expeditions. I know, like, was it 1997? You had some pretty cool stuff happen to you. Six Rivers area, pretty much up the Siskiyou Mountains. You've been on other expeditions up in Canada and a bunch of other things. So you probably have quite a bit of crazy stories that you've experienced out in the field.
Yeah. The in my book, the sort of introductory part talks about that Six Rivers expedition. That was amazing. I mean, that was one of the other things. See, the fact that it's very interesting because I enjoy, for example, by comparison, I enjoy fishing, but I'm not a real patient person. Now I don't mind sitting around as much. I don't mind it as much as back in I was younger and more energetic, and I inherited all my father-in-law's fishing equipment, so I'm going to take that up in retirement for sure. But my point is, in years gone by, if I went out to go fishing and didn't catch a fish soon, I would lose interest and have to go do something else. But if I caught a fish right off the bat, boy, then that meant that there were more there, and I could wait until I caught the next one. So for me, it was kind of very fortuitous that I had this series of experiences. The first set of footprints wasn't an ambiguous, questionable, isolated track that was kind of vague and open to interpretation. They were, boom, slam dunk, either or, and lots of them to show the variation, And then when I went on my first expedition of sorts, or field work, I'd rather just call it field work in the with Richard Greenwell. We were sponsored by a Japanese film company, so we were going to be out there for in excess of a full month, four full weeks, and or more. And the area we chose was right there, just over the ridge from the Bluff Creek film site, in the drainage of the Blue Creek. And we went on up into the wilderness area, quite some distance. We had llamas as pack animals, so we could take plenty of gear. And although we still had pretty hefty packs, personal gear. In any case, it was one of those really interesting things. Right off the bat, we were up in there and we found some tracks. They were a little just sort of titillating. It was the very dry soils, and but I tell you that it sure was compelling to me that we were looking at a bipedal trackway. And then this was in the day before the really nice trail cameras. We had some of these antiquated rigmaroles with clamps for cameras that we had triggers soldered and to the shutter button, and several of them had to be tripped by a fine thread. So you had a black thread you'd string across between, and we had a couple of really state-of-the-art ones that had little laser trip lines, not trip lines, but a laser beam, which was problematic because anything, the wind would blow and a blade of grass would bend or a leaf would fall through that, and it would trigger off a whole series of so on. But we even took, this was interesting and rather groundbreaking. I identified a very interested and cooperative zookeeper from the Midwest who collected female orangutan urine over her cycle. So we had a whole vial of kept in cold storage of this female orangutan urine, which we did deploy. The problem was we didn't have on that trip means to get weather reports, and up there in Northern California, you're close enough to the coast that you get a lot of influence from the coastal weather systems, and fog would roll in or a storm would roll in unexpectedly. There in the mountains, one minute it can be nice and sunny, and the next it's windstorm and thunderstorm. And so we were waiting for just the right time. We didn't guess well, and when we deployed the urine that night, it rained cats and dogs. So destroyed that. And our whole thing, I mean, we were trying everything you could think of. We had the camera traps. We had vocalizations. We had hauled in on our llamas quite a nice little sound system to broadcast vocalizations, and I had collected a repertoire of recordings. We had not only game calls, commercial game calls, but we also had I had found audio libraries that had a variety of great ape sounds. We had gorillas harumphing while they're eating. We had chimpanzees chattering as they're with a kind of a boisterous interaction. I even one of my kids was nursing at that time period, so we got these really good recordings of the baby crying when we would pull it away from the nipple. So it was not just there's a subtle difference in baby cries that our ears are unconsciously attuned to. There is that very annoying cry of an upset child, that is intended to just irritate you to the point that you will address the situation.
Yeah.
But there's also this kind of plaintive cry of a child that needs help, because it needs aid rather than attention. And when we'd pull this baby away, it would do that cry. And I thought, that's got to tug at the heartstrings of any female Sasquatch, worth her salt out there. So we had all the vocalizations, and we were blasting vocalizations. We had the camera traps, we had food baits, we had the little motorized aerosol scent dispensers, battery operated. So we got a bunch of really interesting smells like apple and coconut and things like that, which we had stationed around. So that was the problem, though, that with doing this, we were trying to just load the deck with with our chips, basically every possibility. But then you don't know which one. There's no control, so you don't know what the effectiveness is of the individual attractants that you're trying. So that was kind of the downside. But we had this really interesting experience, I think you wanted me to get to, and that was at one point our local fixer, Mark, and I separated from the group, which at this point the camera crew had left, and we were slated to stay on for an additional few weeks. And boy, I tell you, it was interesting going. This is probably too much information, but it kind of sets the stage. You can appreciate what was happening better. Our guide, our local fixer, he was an interesting outdoorsman, quite capable, but he had that kind of machismo attitude about his outdoor skills and so forth, and the kind of sleep in your boots kind of guy. And he specialized in sort of 3-day off-trail fishing and hunting excursions, and going in very Spartan, very lightweight. And so their typical fare on such 3-day jaunts was oatmeal, instant oatmeal for breakfast, maybe some dried fruit with it. For lunch, you'd have some beef jerky and some more dried fruit probably. And then for dinner, a package of or instant mashed potatoes. And if you were good, he'd throw in an onion soup mix or a ranch dressing mix, to flavor it up. And so that works fine for a Spartan 3-day venture, but we were going to be in there for 30 plus days. So let's see, 3 days, three times 10. That's all we ate for a month. I lost 15 pounds on that trip. That combined with the physical activity of hiking miles and miles and miles and up and down and over Hinnendale and wrangling. I became, that was the funny side. The fellow who was the goat or the llama handler, who had experience with llamas, had another obligation came up, and he had to back out at the last minute. And so Richard Greenwell managed to find a set of llamas on short notice, but they were retired llamas. They were put out to pasture, and they did not appreciate being redrafted to this venture whatsoever. So talk about attitude and lack of cooperation. So I had literally a 15-minute crash course in saddling and packing and grooming and taking care of these llamas, what to do if they split a hoof. They walked me through the first aid kit and where to shoot them if they break a leg, that kind of stuff. And so that was quite an adventure. But it was also, I tell you, when you're that calorie starved, it also had an effect on, the morale and the personal interactions. But we did our best. But anyway, so we were up there. Mark and I had gone to these off-trail lakes in hopes of finding some shrunken lake margins, some shrunken lakes with exposed mud flats. And sure enough, it was ideal situation, except that there were no Sasquatch tracks, but there were bear tracks, there were bears and bear cubs, there were deer and elk and coyote, raccoon, everything you could imagine coming to that lake. So it would have been a great place if we had the wherewithal to spend more time. But on our way back, as twilight came, we kept, making our own calls. We would see who could do the best Bigfoot yell from the mountaintop, the ridgetop, and then we came back down to a spring where we camped underneath these great big cedar trees. It was a beautiful setting. This spring was just covered, overgrown with these, not the Venus flytrap, but another carnivorous plant. I can't think of the name of it now. Pitcher plant, the pitcher plant.
Pitcher plants, yeah.
So like a sort of a alien landscape with these very exotic looking plants, and then this little effluent from the spring and a marshy bog, and then the little stream went down through this cedar grove, and we were camped right in there with two little bivvy tents, little one-man tents. And during the night, or during the wee hours of the morning, it was more like probably about 1 or 2. We stayed up kind of late, and just our rations were down low. The Japanese had left us a few additional things when they left. So this miso soup, if you've ever had, it's a bean soup. Oh, it was like a delicacy. It was such a change of pace. And we were just cuddling this hot cup of soup and drinking this into the wee hours of the night. We finally went to bed about 1:30 or 2. I hear Mark's voice waking me up saying, Jeff. And I come to, regain consciousness, and I could hear this trailing wail, high-pitched wailing call. And he goes, "Do you hear that? Do you hear that?" I said, "Well, yeah, it sounds like it's a ways off. I heard it." We laid there listening. Nothing happened. And I may have dozed off a little bit in and out, but then all of a sudden I heard footfalls. I mean, it was unmistakable. Had heavy padded footfalls beside my tent, just off to the side. And then I heard what at the time I took as it sounded like 2 rocks clacking together. Like that. And it was responded to on the opposite side of our little camp. And, I know bears can do that. First of all, since there were 2, although we never saw tracks of more than 1, I think. But so it could have been my ears playing tricks on me. But in any case, I know bears clack their teeth when they're nervous, just as baboons do when they're nervous, or great apes. They'll yawn and show those big canines, and then they'll snap their jaws together, clack their teeth together. It wasn't until sometime later when I read a passage from John Bindernagel's book, and he described an interview with an eyewitness who had a visual encounter at fairly close proximity. As the Sasquatch retreated, it turned its head, looked right at her, and then proceeded to clack its teeth. She described that very specifically. So it made more sense in hindsight looking at that. Anyway, we had something came in that night when by the time we went to bed, fog was starting to roll in off the coast and up over the mountains, and we got sucked in with pea soup fog. You couldn't see literally 10 feet in front of you. Your flashlight would just dissipate and just illuminate this cloud of fog. But under the cover of the fog, then these footprints or footsteps, and then I could hear the clackety clack. These tents are so small, you cannot have all your gear in there with you, really. So we would put just the basic things we needed for the night, and then our backpacks were either wrapped up in a poncho, or in my case, it was in a big heavy-duty construction garbage bag and tucked under the bushes. But something was rifling through them. And quickly we unzip, you have to get out of your sleeping bag, you get out of the tent fly, and then you get out with our flashlight standing there in their long johns, and it just melts back into the fog. Not a whisper, not a sound. We stood there for 10, 15 minutes, it felt like. And then the dank was starting to penetrate, and we said, okay, well, let's get back in got back in, sat there listening. And at that point, I heard the pad kind of coming around the foot of my tent. I mean, some distance off, 10 yards, maybe at most, 10 feet, more like 10 feet. And then, because it pad, and all of a sudden it's right alongside my tent, and it's dragging its hand, apparently. I can't see it, but I can see what looked like fingertips pressing in on my tent fly, going across it's like it was counting coup. That's how it struck me. It's like it was running up to touch the tent to prove that it wasn't scared of me. And we jumped out real fast again, and I looked over it, and of course, where we were camped underneath these cedars, there wasn't much in the way of grass and just a little pine needle duff on a very rocky, hard surface. So no tracks, but there was right next to me, there was a patch of grass where it had stepped, and you could see the outline, just the outline of the oval shape compressed in the grass, and the grass is just kind of bending back up, and you could hear a splash as it ran down. There was sort of a bushy baffle that separated us from the bog and the spring, and it had run around that apparently and ran right through. Well, I got out again and was looking for any sign, and went over with a flashlight, and sure enough, you could see the punch marks in the bog filled in with water, but in these alternating patterns, bipedal pattern, big 15, 16-inch prints. Anyway, so that was really an interesting. It followed us back, I think, because we the next day it rained, cats and dogs, just torrential rain. We just kind of hunkered in our tents most of the time, and Mark had a migraine type of a situation. He was very uncomfortable for the duration of the day. And then the next morning we packed up, food was gone, we had to get back to base camp. So off we went, and there was a spot we stopped. We had a rock, softball sized rock pitched at us, thrown at us from down slope, made the hair stand up on the back of my neck. Anyway, and then it followed us back to base camp again, rifled through the backpacks. And then this was kind of why I told the food story, because it rifled through the backpacks, but there was nothing there to be had at that point. And we heard footsteps again. You get out of your tent, and of course it just disappeared in the darkness. We didn't have. Let's see. Did we have night vision? We might have had night vision at that time. I'm not sure. We certainly didn't have FLIR. But in any case, all of the remaining foodstuffs were on a rock out in the middle of a meadow. Our guide never hoisted stuff up in the trees. I'll never quite understand that, but all of our food, our very narrow menu was all hermetically sealed, and if you ever opened anything, then that was consumed. So there was never any opened food or food odors really associated that much with it. And so he would just double bag it in a garbage bag and put it out on this rock way out in the middle of this meadow. Well, we went out the next morning to retrieve some. We were getting down to the dregs, basically, but here's the garbage bags standing at attention, wide open. But the only thing that's missing is this big 2-gallon Ziploc bag with all the remaining flavored oatmeal. And see, that was the favorite food item, because that's the one that had the most sugar in it. It was this flavored, sweetened, cinnamon and raisin and so forth. And so that was coveted. Everyone would prefer a bowl of flavored oatmeal over mashed potatoes and beef jerky. But so the joke was, well, it was none of us, because none of us would have dared hijack it. If any one of us got caught with a stash of oatmeal, they'd be strung up in the nearest tree. So anyway, that was so funny, because just again, to put the human side on it, we hiked out, long trek out, and again, the llamas did not like to be loaded. And it was a pretty steep climb. It was a place called, you're familiar with that neck of the woods there, Elk Hole.
Oh yeah, I've been there.
It's a steep, we almost lost one of the llamas going down, there's not much of a trail, and one of them slid off and tipped over head first and slid under a deadfall, was wedged under a deadfall. So we had to completely unpack him, and literally the three of us had to pull him up out high enough that he could get his feet rolled underneath him. I thought we were going to have to shoot him. Of course, then we would have law mistake, and so that might have been.
There you go.
But in any case, we got back to the trailhead, and our ride was going to come pick us up. And we phoned out, got him, let him know that we were waiting for him. And there's a little greasy spoon on the way up to that trailhead down in town. I can't remember which little town it was in, but we said, oh, you got to stop, get us some burgers. And I wanted a big, loaded cheeseburger. And I said, make it 2. No, make it 3. I want 3 cheeseburgers. Well, he comes back. I got halfway through 1 and couldn't eat anymore. My stomach was so shrunk that I just couldn't eat anymore. I just had no room. I would try to sit there and chew and chew and chew. You know, when you're so full and you chew and chew and you can't swallow, there's the natural swallow reflex won't kick in. That was me. So I just packed them away. But boy, yeah, I got home. It was like, what happened to you? I was just gaunt and skinny. I haven't looked that skinny since I had surgery. But anyway.
Yeah, that restaurant's no longer there. It's closed. Been closed.
Is that right?
Yeah. I've
It
been
was
there
a good
myself
burger.
a couple times. Yes, it was.
No reflection on the burger. It was simply
No.
that was an interesting experience. But I've tried to make it a practice to be out at least a month every summer, pretty much since then, in one form or another. And I've only done one solo. There was an opportunity when to go out in the field, and then the people I was going to meet up with, there was again a family emergency, and plans had to be changed. But I was already packed. I was already ready to hit the road. So I thought, I'm just going to do it. And I don't recommend it because I was doing things I probably shouldn't have done. Like I would routinely just start off from camp and mark my camp as the waypoint, pack a lunch, and enough gear and enough emergency just in case. But I would strike out and just hike a great big loop, and hike about 10 or 15 miles in one great big loop, cutting through backcountry. But the problem with that is if anything happens, one misstep and break a leg or something, and no one knows. If I had one of those spot locators,
Yeah,
that would be a different story, perhaps. But I'm just going to say it's a real interesting experience to be out there completely by yourself. Your mind goes through a whole process. We are so used to sound bites and snippets and constant stimulation. Constant feedback, especially with devices. This next generation is just addicted to that constant stimulation. You take that away and your brain just bounces all over. Your thoughts bounce all over the place. And then after a few days, it would sort of settle down to where you're just sort of planning out what you need to do. And then after a few more days, there wasn't even the planning. It was dealing with the here and now. And then whatever came next, you dealt with that. You might plan to undertake a project or an excursion that was really, really interesting. And then, of course, coming to grips with your mind playing all kinds of games at night. Everything is amplified and sensational at night, and realizing through that. People would ask me, how do you go out there in the woods? Aren't you afraid? Well, yes, I was afraid. I mean, fear is a natural, you have to channel it though, and you have to intellectualize it. And so, unlike being afraid a Bigfoot's behind every tree trunk, you get to the point where you hope a Bigfoot is behind every tree trunk. After all, that's what you're out there for, isn't it?
yeah.
I once was asked by a colleague, a very negative colleague, and he did it in a circumstance where he was trying to embarrass me, or rake me over the coals, trivialize what I was doing. But he said, what if these creatures really exist, and you're out there, and one of them runs you down and inflicts bodily harm? What then? And I said, well, it'll be a lot easier to get my next grand. He did not appreciate that at all. The whole room burst into laughter, and it totally, what's the word? When you disarmed the audience.
Oh,
Yeah. That's what you hang on tight. You get a hair sample.
That's right, exactly.
Hey, my phone's about ready to call it quits on this end. So
Okay.
Tate, if my phone bumps out, I got to charge it back up. If it does, Jeff, thank you so much for talking. You know, keep
My
going,
pleasure.
but Tate's got a few more things for you. But if you don't hear me at the
Okay.
very end, it's because my phone just went. It had enough of me.
Okay. You bet. Understand.
But it's been a pleasure. So Tate, go right ahead. I'll try to. I'll walk away because I get my charger to do the same thing Tate just did.
That's fine. That's fine.
Okay, thank you.
Worries. No
You got it,
worries.
Tate.
No. Well, I basically before. I mean, I think we've gone about 2 hours, a little over 2 hours now.
Okay.
And so it's getting late for me. But before we into this, Jeff, you kind of talked about it already. I wanted to get your opinion on what you think if the Patterson Gimlin film could be real or could be fake.
I'm as convinced as I could be, short of having stood there on the sandbar, that it's the real deal. If I had just the footprints from that site, that incident, I would be very, very convinced, very positive about its credibility, because the footprint record, I mean, so much so that it was the footprints from that site that I chose as the type specimens for the ichnotaxon, the naming of the footprints, Anthropoidopes ameriborealis. Those 2 cast by Bob and the 10 cast by the 2 cast by Roger and Bob and the 2 cast by Bob. 10. Let me start over again. The 2 cast by Roger and Bob on the site at the time, and the 10 cast by Bob Titmus some days later. Those in themselves are enough. But when you have that remarkable documentation combined with a film of the track maker, and you can witness the kinematics of the footfall and step and so forth, and gait associated with that track, and then not to mention all of the anatomy from head to toe. It's just, it's one of those things where the audacity of some individuals to opine about a topic. There was a documentary in which Chris Packham was a producer, a BBC affiliate producer, and his goal in his production was to try to debunk the film. That was why he wanted to make a mark by debunking the film. There was one scene where he is in, I don't know if it was the Jim Henson Creature Shop. It was actually, I think it was, but they had a costume maker, and he's watching the clip on a video monitor, and then he says, "Oh, well, that's obviously a man in a fursuit, and here's how we do it." And the camera pans away to left, and here's the actor donning a costume, a contemporary costume, and it consists of this spandex undergarment with a sewn in, stitched in foam rubber armature, and to give it contour and bulk. And then he pulls on this 4-way stretch fur jersey and pants and gloves, and of course the costume has 6-inch to 8-inch hair to cover up the wrist seam, the cuffs, and around the neck. There's a long beard, and it's a ridiculous looking costume. And the feet have floppy toes with a divergent big toe sticking out to the side. But wait a minute, in 1967 they didn't have spandex. They were just barely experimenting with injected foam rubber to make these false appliances they used in the original Planet of the Apes. John Chambers won an honorary Oscar for his pioneering techniques in the costume design for that movie. They didn't have 4-way stretch fur. They had fur cloth. And if you've ever seen it, if you've seen that, there's a classic picture now, it's classic, of Bob Hieronymus in the costume that Philip Morris concocted, reverse engineered for him, and it's fur cloth, and it hangs in folds, and it has straight lines, and the edges around the funny looking feet are just artificial looking, and not to mention all the face and so forth. So there just wasn't the materials in 1967 to do that. And but beyond that, there is remarkable anatomy. There was all this kind of criticism being lofted around about folds creases and different things in the wrong places, and football shoulder pads showing through, and this, that, and the other. Well, it's interesting because Bill Munns and I went through and picked out surface features that of skin folds and contours and pits and so forth that were landmarks associated with anatomy, and then went to just online. If you want examples, if you want models to exhibit these surface landmarks, just go to from everyday people, not the extraordinary models and so forth and pinups and whatnot. But if you go to a naturalist's page on the web and look at some of these candid shots at a nudist colony or a nude beach, and it was amazing how many examples we could line up that showed the same sags, the same folds, the same dimples and so forth in all the right places that you saw it with. And then I went through the online image collections of great apes and found numerous examples also from gorillas and chimps and so forth with hair that didn't obscure. It wasn't long enough to obscure, like in a big male orangutan, for example. But exact same. The folds on the back was a great one, down that kind of paralleled the outline of the scapula, the shoulder blade. And yet when you saw anything comparable on a fur cloth costume, if a fold was present, it went all the way across. Mm-hmm. It was unbroken. There wasn't a bilateral symmetry of the anatomy because our skin is, tacked down pretty good over the spines of our vertebrae. So one fold doesn't transgress over, it has to be replicated on the other side. Anyway, that kind of stuff. And then muscle mass. I'll sometimes I'll show it to my anatomy students and I'll ask them, all right, start at the top of the head and identify every muscle group that you can see. And they'll sit there, here's the trapezius, here's the deltoid, here's the two heads of the triceps, triceps, there's the rectus femoris, there's all, you can see the tendon. If you reach down behind your knee on the outside, there's like a guitar string. That's the tendon of the biceps femoris muscle. And that's just as clear as day on that film. You don't see things like that in a padded foam rubber costume, even if you had one. So yes, a long answer, long response, but I'm quite convinced. I mean, that's why I'm quite convinced. I haven't just drawn an opinion, but I've reached a conclusion based on a whole lineup of different types of evidence that yes, indeed, that's the real deal.
Jeff, I couldn't have said it any better, honestly.
Oh, good.
That's probably the best answer we've ever gotten for that question, in my opinion. So,
oh, really?
Hands down. Yeah.
Well, good.
So, Jeff, I want to thank you for coming on again.
I'm just going to add, anybody who says, "Oh, that's just a man in a fursuit," immediately wears their ignorance on their coat, on their shirt sleeve. Yep. Because anything but just, if it is a man in a fursuit, it remains the most sophisticated and expertly executed costume ever. You have to ignore the experts of the time. I mean, much better than this ridiculous newbie at the Jim Henson's Creature Shop. The Jonas Prohaska, when he was asked, I mean, there's the contemporary guy. There's the expert of the time, and he looked at it and was quite frank. He said, if this was a costume, it would have to be hair glued onto the surface of the actor, and it would take about 8 hours to do that. But what he didn't add on to that, it would take about 8 hours to do that if you could find anybody on this planet that came anywhere close to the physical dimensions, whether it's 6.5 feet tall or 7.5 feet tall, to those physical dimensions. And that's another disservice. I guess tonight's the beat up on David Daglin night, but in his book, he takes Grover to task about his statement that there is no living human that approximates those statements. And then David went to a big anthropometric catalog, an atlas, which is measurements, physical measurements, a whole slew of physical measurements from head to toe of military recruits, essentially. I mean, it's the database that are used, that databases that are used in order to generate sizes for uniforms, for ergonomic dimensions of cockpits and tanks and so forth. You know, you can't build a tank that no soldier can slide into the driver's seat, you know. And so he pointed out, in his opinion, a measurement that contradicted what Grover had said. Well, I went and looked that up and I read it carefully, and David had chosen the wrong measurement. He chose a Tate measurement, which is a measurement where you take a, measuring tape and you go from armpit across the front of the chest to the other armpit. That's very different than a projected width, just a straight line width of between the shortest distance between those 2 points. And I pointed that out to him because that was the one part that he felt contradicted to Grover's. I pointed out his mistake. He wouldn't acknowledge it. He wouldn't retract it from his article, and then published it extensively and discussed it even further in his book, even though it's absolutely wrong. Grover's absolutely right. If you take the dimensions, proportionalities even if it's not absolute dimensions, but the proportionalities of Patty, as seen on the film, there is no human that could fill that bill if the hair was glued to their body surface without any extra. And then even when you try to build out with shoulder pads and whatnot, you can't move the joint centers away. And it's going to look obvious. It's going to, it's like someone wearing a dress jacket that has the shoulders built out, but it's the wrong size. And so it comes out and then it dips back into their arm. You can't move that joint center, let alone the hips, because Patty's built like a brick wall. Her shoulder joints are about the same width as her pelvis is. She's just almost straight up and down. Well, even if you get a human with those broad shoulders, almost invariably there's a T shape to the torso, and the hips aren't nearly that big. So if you artificially make that, then the joint center's clear in here. It's going to look really weird. That thing goes walking along. Anyway.
Yep, I was going to say that. And the whole thing of Philip Morris saying they put football shoulder pads kind of goes along with what you're saying. I'm like, it doesn't make sense.
Oh, right. If you want some entertainment, he does public speaking events where he talks about this. And someone finally sent me a link, and I sat and watched his presentation. It is the most laughable plain assertion on his part. I mean, he just doesn't have the wherewithal. He doesn't know about human biomechanics or kinematics or that to begin with. And the statements that he makes are just so erroneous, so off base. And yet they lap it up, the people believe what they want to believe. I mean, that's
true.
One thing I think that caught Morrison a lie was they were saying, did the boobs bounce? And he was like, what are you talking about, the boobs bounce? I made the costume for the film and there was no boobs on it. And when they filmed the recreation for the show he did, they could clearly see boobs were bouncing. And in the Patterson Gimlin film, there was breasts on Patty, clear as day.
Oh, yeah.
If you blow it up and you see a really good image of it.
Oh, yeah. Well, and Bill Munns did a really interesting study, which I helped to facilitate, helped to fund, where he had pointed out there's a series of frames where when Patty takes a step, and we've all done this, where we think that the sidewalk is at this level, and really it's about a half inch lower. And so you come down with a bit of a jolt, and you can see the shock wave go right up her leg, through her quads, and to the torso, and the breast tissue goes just as natural as could be. It's not foam, sculpted foam rubber, for example. It's not, even a water bag would behave differently. And so Bill did the experiments, created a little device that you'd stand on, and you pull the pin and it drops a quarter of an inch and it generates that shock wave. And then with using high-speed filming, he could capture that image, and he had several human female models for the subject do that, and you can see that. Then he built a number of contrivances with water bags or with sculpted foam or with latex rubber, and tried to replicate, and you know, nothing comes close. It's real living tissue. It's clearly real living tissue, and it's a little, unless you've got high speed, or unless you've got the means to play the film. But you can see, even in a regular one, right just about where she gets to that little bit of a gap, right near the 352 frame, as her right leg comes down, you can see that shockwave. That's also where you can see the tendon of the biceps femoris behind her knee real clearly. But when her foot hits, you can see the shockwave go up her thigh just as clearly as could be.
I have to look at that again.
Oh yeah, it's definitely notable.
Yeah, I tell you, that clip that was generated when John Green commissioned names. It'll pop in my head here in just a minute. Rick Knoll to generate a set of high resolution digital images. You know, he photographed them microscopically, actually, the individual frames off a very clean, I don't know if it was the second or third generation copy. But then the images were digitally split. Their color channels were split. You know, there's always been this issue about the lens on the camera. It was an inexpensive lens, a lower quality lens that wasn't corrected for chromatic aberration, which means that some of the wavelengths are refracted a little differently than others. And so some colors will be in sharp focus while the others are slightly out of focus because the lens hasn't focused them on the film platen properly. So in the digital world, you can subtract away those color channels, and effectively it's like the Claritin commercial. It's like peeling a film. And you know, I've seen the demonstration of the before and after. The before, there's just a little bit of a haze, and then you see the color subtracted. It turns out, I think it was the red that was in sharp focus, and then it was rendered in grayscale. But it's just suddenly that little blur around the edges disappears. And so who was it? Then M.K. Davis got a hold of a CD with those individual images, and then stabilized and strung them together and played them at the proper film speed, about 16 or 18 frames per second. And I tell you, that clip, if you haven't seen that, and it's out and about, I've used it in many a presentation. It's like you've never experienced the film before. There's some other good ones now that haven't been color split, but I'll show that to my students. Again, like I said, I'll show that one to my students. You know, you can sit and it's on a loop, so it just plays and plays and plays, and it becomes mesmerizing as they notice more detail, and they work their way down. And we talk about the proportions of the face, we talk about the high attachment of the trapezius, and so on. And you know, it's just you look at it with a whole different eye, and it's you know, I tell people, you look at that, and she is adapted to the habitat you see her in. She shows the physical adaptations for a creature that is right at home. You know, she's not out of place. She hasn't stepped through a portal. She hasn't shape shifted or time traveled or anything like that. She's perfectly at home in that environment, in my estimation. Anyway, I'll stop.
It's all good. I wanted to thank you, Jeff, for coming on and taking the time out of your busy schedule to be with us. And we appreciate all the stuff you had, and I enjoyed it as much as our listeners will. So thank you again.
You bet. My pleasure.
Oh, hey, Jeff, I got one last thing for you. Anything exciting in the pipe coming down we should need to keep our heads up for, like another show you're going to be on, or?
Well, I did some stuff for the what is it, Expedition Sasquatch or Expedition Bigfoot? I can't remember which Sasquatch. I think the one with Russell Acord and Maria Mayor.
Expedition Bigfoot.
So they're right. I don't know if their second season premiere has aired yet or not, but I think I'll have a brief appearance there and some interesting things to say. based on some evidence that they asked for an opinion on, an assessment of. I'm just plugging away, trying to balance things, and I've got a number of projects of my own going, as far as writing, for example, but also I mentioned briefly the eDNA. That's the big push. I'm going to try to get the virtual footprints archive back up and going ahead with more productivity, and so that these three-dimensional scans of the footprint collection will soon be available and easily accessible to public investigators and enthusiasts. The Relic Hominoid Inquiry, if you're not familiar with that, is an online journal that I edit. And again, we had kind of a little bit of a slow period here during COVID, but I'm returning attention back to that, and we're reorganizing the editorial board. There's been some we've lost some members, some passing of some of our editorial board, as well as people having to move on to other obligations and so forth. So we're reorganizing that. Got some more people involved. Interesting. That'll hopefully stimulate too some activity. But I've got a number of things in the pipeline. People submitting research and book reviews and commentary and so forth. So if you're not familiar with that, simply www.isu.edu/RHI, or if you Google the Relic Hominoid Inquiry, it's an online open access journal. You can download the PDFs easily to have your own copy, and really, we're going into our 9th or 10th year, and it's a smaller output, but every year we see 2 or 3 research articles or essays. We see a couple of book reviews. We have editorials. We have commentaries and so forth. And so there's a lot of good information, some really interesting articles there.
Cool.
A lot of historical things too. A lot of Dr. Kaufman's work translated from Russian is reprinted there. So if you're interested in the Russian Almas, something a bit different than the Sasquatch, perhaps more like a Neanderthal, a relic Neanderthal, or Denisovan, who knows? But really fascinating historical stuff.
Sweet. Dick Levin, one of our customers, we interviewed him, and he was really into the Russian stuff too. So yeah, he's excited about that.
It's fascinating. There are Sasquatch equivalents as well. I went over there as a guest of Dmitry Pirkulov, who's an active investigator who works in Moss Films. That's the Russian equivalent of Hollywood, producing largely travel log and natural history documentary type of productions, and historical productions. But he's very interested, has been down to the Caucasus numerous times, took me down there one time, and we followed up on a pair of footprints of the Dev, which is the Sasquatch equivalent, not the Neanderthal type. These were tracks. If I shuffled them in with a selection of Bigfoot tracks, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference, just like them. And so it was a fascinating trip. Beautiful country down there. But anyway, yeah, interesting things going on around the globe.
Sweet. I appreciate your time, and thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Yes, thank you. Can't wait for all that stuff to come out. So thank you, Robert, for helping tonight. And again,
Sure.
Jeff, thank you for your time. So until next time, guys, we're the Bluff Creek Project Podcast.